members of council, members of Senate, chairperson of Senate, the principal and vice chancellor, members of the executive management and the extended management, members of the university community, the UNISA academic community, colleagues, our students, and ladies and gentlemen, Sanbonani, good afternoon, Molweni, Dimacheroni, Goeiemiddag, Dimategwan. It does give me great pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to welcome you to Professor P. Msweli's inaugural lecture. Let me take the opportunity to acknowledge Prof. Tenjiwe Meiwa, the Vice Principal for Research, Postgraduate Studies, Innovation and Commercialization, Prof. K.M. Masemola, the Executive Dean of the College of Human Sciences. Prof. Masemola will be responding to Prof. Msweli's inaugural lecture also. I do want to take this opportunity to welcome the school's leadership, her colleagues, friends present here this afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to also welcome and acknowledge Prof. Msweli's family present here or in attendance. Ladies and gentlemen, I do take this opportunity to welcome you, all of you, to the University of South Africa, the University of the Land. As I welcome you at a time when we were subjected to stringent COVID-19 pandemic regulations that have also made this inaugural lecture take a different shape altogether. We do appreciate, though, that we have now had disaster regulations repealed, but that does not mean we should relax and lower our guard against the pandemic. We are still in danger, and therefore we need to protect ourselves at all times. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused havoc in the way we do things. The years 2020 and 2021 will go down in history as the years which defined the new normal. Unfortunately, COVID-19 disrupted economies globally and placed in disarray our social systems, and lest we forget the loss of life in ways unimaginable across the world. We as UNISA, of course, we were not spared. We have lost staff and students, and more importantly, we have lost family members and our friends. Of major concern with COVID-19 pandemic was the impact it had on our ability to deliver services to our students. We have, through our learning management system, though, managed to deliver both the learning content and assessments in ways unimaginable. Our technology saved us and our students the extended academic years. Though these actions have helped, it does not mean these efforts were not without challenges. You all know that UNISA is the longest existing and dedicated and the largest distance education institute in the world, which was founded in 1873. And today, we are 149 years old, and next year, we will be 150. And it is important that we plan for celebrations. We do cater for the student population that is equivalent to 1/3 of all South African higher education institutions and constituted more than 90% of all the students enrolled in distance learning programs. Historically, of course, this university is perhaps the only university in South Africa to have provided all people with access to education irrespective of race, color, or creed. Today, as we pride ourselves for having the first woman principal and vice chancellor in 149 years, it's indicative of our efforts to ensure that UNISA continues to be the transformative university in the service of humanity. As a comprehensive university, open, distance, and e-learning institution, CODEL, we are guided by the principles of lifelong learning, student-centeredness, innovation, and creativity. Because of CODEL, we contribute to the knowledge creation, advancement of humankind, and development of a critical citizenry to advance global sustainability. We achieve these through our learner-centeredness approach, which provides for lifelong learning in a flexible learning environment through interactive learning materials, thereby increasing access into higher education for most of our disadvantaged learners. We also pride ourselves in the development and promotion of our own staff so that they can continue to support our students and communities around us. We are very grateful that this inaugural lecture is taking place within the context of our renewed spirit in the context of our revised UNISA 2020 strategy and our strategic plan. In some ways, Prof. Msweli's inaugural lecture has come at the right time. It is the time for the serious consideration of transformation ideals within the context of UNISA, our higher education sector, and South Africa as a whole. We are proud that today, UNISA continues to demonstrate the value of a strong cadre of professorship that is necessary to instill in our students critical thinking and analysis of the highest order. This is a very proud moment for every academic as it reflects one of the pinnacles of academic achievement. It does give us great pleasure that our rank of full professors is growing substantially, and we are of the view that such will also grow our research expertise in leaps and bounds in South Africa, in our continent, and the world. Ladies and gentlemen, in terms of today's proceedings, Professor Meiwa will introduce Prof. Msweli, and she will invite her to the podium. Prof. Masemola will then follow after Prof. Msweli with the response to her lecture without any further announcements. I now invite Prof. Meiwa to the podium. I thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kehlandlovu, for ushering me in. Professor of Education, he's the Vice Principal for Strategy, Risk and Advisory Services. Thanks for that. I want to acknowledge the Graduate School of Business Leadership, Management and Staff, and everybody who is attending this lecture, all the patrons, but want to single out Professor Msweli, who reports to me, who is also the celebrity of this evening. Thank you for coming. My role, my name is Professor Thenjiwe Meiwa. I'm the Vice Principal that's responsible for research and postgraduate studies, amongst other elements. And my role here is just to let you know about the work and the life a bit in a narrative format from a scholarly point of view, career academically, of Prof. Msweli. Prof. Phumela Msweli is the Executive Dean and the Chief Executive Officer of UNISA's Graduate School of Business Leadership, that is in Midrand. Professor Msweli has 8 years' experience in academic leadership. As an Executive Dean at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, she worked collaboratively with executive management in leading the Faculty of Management Studies in a measure of an 18,000-strong combined faculty student population, incorporating the Old University of Natal, Durban, Old University of Natal, Pietermaritzburg, and the Old University of Durban-Westville. In her tenure at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, she provided leadership in the CHE accreditation of the MBA program on behalf of the newly merged University of KwaZulu-Natal. She then moved on to the University of Limpopo as an executive dean. She worked with faculty there to transform the research culture of the academic enterprise. Research productivity in the faculty at University of Limpopo improved by more than 60%. That was just within 2 years, 2012 to 2014. We look forward to you, Prof. Msweli, doing that with SBL. At the University of Limpopo, she also spearheaded a staff and student exchange internationalization project that has seen students from Germany, the university there, as well as students at the University of Limpopo working collaboratively. The partnership that she pioneered while she was at the University of Limpopo continues to deliver substantial benefits. As the CEO and Executive Dean of UNISA's School of Business Leadership, SBL as we call it, she's responsible for providing leadership and for facilitating collaborative, engaged scholarship endeavors with captains of industry, with SBL alumni, with staff and students to gain lost market share, thereby leveraging on UNISA's unparalleled footprint in the African continent. With strong support from the Executive Committee colleagues within the School of Business Leadership and from the staff there, she has made strides in establishing a futuristic, vibrant, student-centric culture that nourishes the intellectual adeptness of current and future leaders that they interact with in different engaged scholarship spaces that they've created through a business school. Great work. Professor Msweli has 10 years corporate experience, which she gained as a marketing director of a multinational enterprise and as a training and development consultant at the South African Reserve Bank during the years 2017 to 2018. Her corporate experience provided her with the understanding of the style and structure of the corporate landscape. She has first-hand change management experience acquired through her interaction with diverse teams across multiple business settings and across multiple financial regulatory bodies in the SADC region. She has had the privilege of working with central bankers from Sub-Saharan Africa as well as from New York Federal Reserve Bank. She's also had a privilege of visiting a bank in Germany, Deutsche Bank, to gather further experience in the management of the financial sector training interventions. Phumela Msweli's exposure to international settings as a visiting scholar at St. Mary's University in Canada and at the University of Mauritius, as well as her experience as a visiting professor during the years 2016 to 2021 at Friedrich Alexander University in Germany and at the Institute of Economics, and also at the Institute of Economics there, heightened her geopolitical business knowledge, which we now are eating from at UNISA. And as an international business professor, she understands the practical and theoretical underpinnings of business and how important that is for international trade and in shaping political economy and geopolitics of the environment businesses are operating and embedded in. She's been teaching geopolitical history of international trade in Africa from different time spaces, including the time when trade currency was still actually troubled, to times beyond that, that is the Berlin Conference, in which she's participated, looking at all of those challenges in those spaces, looking also, as I said earlier, the Berlin Conference of 1884 that resulted in all the troubles and scrambles that we see in Africa right now. She's participated in a number of organizations, formations that have been looking at Africa continental free trade agreements. And one part agreement that I want to make reference to is the one that was signed and ratified in 2019. As an academic, Professor Msweli has published locally and internationally in the area of international business, governance, and strategy. She supervised 18 doctoral students and 41 master's students to completion, that is, walking the graduation stage. Professor Msweli's intellectual finance is underpinned by 3 key formal qualifications. She has an international MBA acquired from the University of Exeter Business School in the UK, which she got by cum laude, by the way. And Exeter Business School is, for information purposes, among the only 1% of global institutions to gain Triple Crown accreditation from 3 most influential business school accreditation organizations. 2, she also has a qualification, a Master of Philosophy in Development Finance from a Triple Crown accredited university of Stellenbosch University, that is the Stellenbosch Business School. She also has a PhD in management, which she completed in 2001 at the University of Exeter in the UK. Just a brief about her resume. She's been rated by the NRF. She has had awards and a variety of honors. Hence, we're celebrating her this evening. She's been a recipient of a number of funding awards, including being a recipient of Black Women Association's Regional Award at the Regional Women Entrepreneur of the year 2005. She's also been a recipient of a grant to attend the United Nations Roundtable Discussions on African Women Empowerment in the early 2000s. She's also had a number of awards. They're too numerous to mention. She's also gotten an award at a university, a sister university, University of Durban, University of Technology, as a best supervisor. She got an award for that. Ladies and gentlemen, patrons of this lecture, with all that resume, you must be looking forward to listen to this lecture. I now call upon Professor Phumela Msweli to come to the podium and let us hear more about her scholarship. Over to you, Prof. Msweli.
Esteemed Vice-Chancellor, Professor Lingabula, Vice Principal, Strategy, Risk and Advisory Services, Professor Ndlovu, my line manager, Professor Meyiwa, Vice Principal, Research, Postgraduate Studies, Innovation and Commercialization, my esteemed respondent, Professor Masemula, Executive Dean, College of Human Sciences, my SBL colleagues, SBL community, SBL alumni, broader UNISA community, my friends, family, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Professor Phumela Msweli. The title of my inaugural lecture is A Reflexivity Dance of Warriors Towards a Historiometric Model of Leadership Performance in Extreme Contexts in Africa. I'm covering 8 topics before I make a conclusion. The first topic is just to introduce my inaugural lecture. Thereafter, I'm going to define extreme context and the extreme context situation specific to this inaugural lecture. Thereafter, I'll look at leadership effectiveness, particular focus on getting the archetypical mix right. The next topic is warrior mystique and leadership reflexivity, a conceptual bridge. And then I will talk about the approach, the historiometric approach I used for this inaugural lecture. Thereafter, I present the snippets of historical cases, and the last part of my inaugural lecture is a presentation of a warrior mystique leadership dance framework. In this lecture, I present a conceptual integration of critical reflexivity and leadership archetype theory to capture the traits and characteristics of leaders. The focus of my attention is leadership in extreme contexts. More specifically, I cast a historiometric glance at wars, battles, and conflicts led by women warriors alongside their men in Africa during the transatlantic trade period in the 15th to the 19th century. This 400-year period, that is 15th to the 19th century, is an extraordinary time in the history of Africa. This is where commodization and ownership of human beings through bondage, hardwired by the decisions taken during the 1884 to 1885 Berlin Conference that orchestrated imposition of colonization. There are over 100 battles and wars that were waged in Africa during this period. And the purpose of these wars was to seize and conquer territories in Africa to gain access to slaves and raw material for the burgeoning transatlantic trade. Arguably, there is no context where leadership qualities are more discernible and pivotal than in extreme contexts. How leaders behave in these extreme contexts has massive effects on the broader socioeconomic system. A reflective glance into the past using historiometric methodology enables an objective analysis of the positive as well as the dark side of leaders whose behaviors sowed the seeds of the African geopolitical space as we experience these spaces today. I conceptualize deep space as the leadership in extreme context narrative that I have created using archetypes and the dance metaphor. I define archetypes as power centers and invisible landscapes locked in the psyche of leaders. These power centers provide channels for thoughts and leadership behavior. A metaphor, on the other hand, is a created deep space to blend ideas in a way that allows for adaptability in different social realities. I offer the dance metaphor and archetypes as a theoretical bridge and a tool to problematize leadership performance in extreme contexts. Dance, as an operative metaphor, makes visible the invisible virtuosity of the human body. Dance mobilizes a visual expression of physical reflexivity. In extreme contexts, the leadership dance of a warrior requires reflexivity beyond the physical realm. The lecture attempts to engage with the tensions and dilemmas men and women warriors leading in extreme contexts in Africa faced. In my discussions, I reflexively use my opening discussion to bring to the fore the similarities between dance and leadership. I then invoke the magic of dance and its mystic effects on how leaders influence their followers through reflexivity. I present three arguments in this lecture. First, I argue that warrior leaders, I present three arguments in this lecture. Firstly, I argue that warrior leaders leading in extreme contexts are powered by a deeper knowing located in the archetypical space of the human psyche, which is accessed using reflexivity capabilities. Given the connection between archetype and metaphor, see, for example, Arian, 1993, I problematize leadership performance in extreme contexts so as to shed light into the leadership traits required for effective leadership performance. I set the transatlantic trade era as an extreme leadership context against which historiometric data for leadership performance can be analyzed. Secondly, I argue that a myopic leadership approach that does not draw lessons from failures and successes of leadership from different historical contexts becomes insufficient and unsatisfactory from the perspectives of liberating Africa from all forms of violence and slavery located deep in the psyche and DNA of her people and her institutions. I move the frontiers of knowledge forward by offering a third space, leadership practice framework, where the warrior archetypical metaphor meets reflexivity. Lastly, I argue that leaders leading in this current time in Africa are leading in extreme contexts, similar to the transatlantic slavery period. In the 21st century in Africa, we have been waging geopolitical wars long before the onset of the Ukrainian war. There are civil conflicts in our communities. There are industrial conflicts in our institutions. And there are wars that modern day warriors are waging against poverty, inequality, and the corona pandemic with all its socio-economic effects. All these contexts qualify to be referred to as extreme contexts, given that they meet Hannah et al. 2009's criteria defining extreme context. And Hannah defines extreme conflicts as contexts which include risk of severe physical, psychological, or material consequences. If the current leaders leading in Africa during this time are not leading in extreme context, why is the African Union inviting African leaders in contemporary Africa to free the African continent of wars, civil conflicts, humanitarian crisis, human rights violations, gender-based violence, and genocide in a project titled Silencing the Guns in Africa by the year 2020 project, by the year 2020. In concluding this inaugural lecture, I'll be demonstrating the contingent and fluid nature of leadership in extreme contexts and how its practices enable development of a very special kind of nimbleness, agility, kinetic, intuitive, visual, mystic warrior leadership capabilities that are required to lead influentially and impactfully in transforming and liberating the people of our country and continent. My conclusion moves from the premise that while technology, globalization, and now the Ukrainian war have catapulted society into new institutional and geopolitical behaviors characterized by new market patterns, hiking petrol prices, and a possibility of a serious financial meltdown, slavery still exists, albeit imperceptible to an uninitiated eye. Slavery is embedded in our psyche and is concealed in our minds. Our fears of our proverbial master, our fears to express an alternative voice to the voice of the hegemonic powers that rule our institutions and the world is no different to the fear that enslaved people of the transatlantic trade war experienced. I then move to defining extreme contexts as defined by experts and scholars in literature. Following on Hannah et al.'s definition of extreme context, I define this extreme context as an event or an occurrence that may result in extensive and unbearable magnitude of physical, psychological, or material consequences to society and its institutions. Examples of extreme contexts abound in literature, including natural disasters, space exploration, fire departments, law enforcement units, deep sea fishing, disaster discovery organizations, military combat units, medical emergency services, etc. There is no context where the virtuosity of the leadership dance, the capability to tap into individual and collective wisdom is more critical. In extreme context, the dance is freestyle. There's no routine. It's based on asymmetrical information on the ground and requires high decision agency. Participating in this dance is almost like signing your death certificate. According to Ezenwa and Udensi 2021, page 143, the 400 years between 1500 and 1900 was an extreme context of unbearable pain and trauma that, I quote, violently arrested, I close quote, Africa's development. Literature, see, for example, Ezenwa and Udensi in 2021, they make it quite clear that slavery was enabled often by a complicitous relationship between African leaders and foreign slave traders. Dasa 2012 concurs with this view and posits that African leaders, past and present, are complicit in the persistent fragility of post-colonial sub-Saharan Africa. Now let us look at the specific situation around which this lecture is situated. With these words, Ezenwa Udensi paints a picture of the devastating effects of transatlantic trade on the humanness of Africans. I quote, "Slavery of the transatlantic variety was designed to terrorize, dehumanize, animalize, and reduce the status of the average African to mere chattel to be bought and sold in the open market. The essence of the African person as a human being, his mind and spirit, was completely crushed by the unspeakable savagery of violence unleashed on the victims by the white predators and their corrupt native allies. The plague of slavery caught Africa unawares. It tore through her very marrow and choked all attempts at advancement," I close quote. In this extreme context of the transatlantic age, men and women warriors commanded troops to fight in battles and wars to protect their territories. Warrior women leaders meted death and died alongside their men. Towards the tail end of the transatlantic slave trade, when communities of the African continent were at the highest of heights of vulnerability, paralyzed by fear and grief, the 1885 Berlin Conference presented to an uninformed African a fait accompli new world with boundaries defined in Europe. The Berlin Conference was convened to establish principles and rules for colonizing Africa. Here is one of the conversations of the time captured in Wang Xing Zhang's 1998 work. And this citation is by Lord Salisbury. I quote, "When I left the Foreign Office in 1880, nobody thought of Africa. When I returned in 1885, nations of Europe were almost quarreling with each other." I close quote. In his work, Wang Shizong, 1998, discusses how the Berlin Conference guided the acquisition of new territory in Africa by using any of the following modalities. The first one is conquest, cession, and occupancy or settlement. With these in place, the scramble for Africa started. This is where the existing conflicts in Africa were entrenched. The Berlin Conference, therefore, legitimized the creation of boundaries in Africa. Ken Wilber, a philosopher based in America, has this to say about boundaries. I quote, "Boundaries are pure illusions. They pretend to separate what is not, in fact, separable. Every boundary carries technological and political power. It also carries alienation, fragmentation, and conflict." In Figure 1, I illustrate the boundaryless Africa before the Berlin Conference. In 1880, you will notice that Africa had no boundaries. In 1913, you will notice now that countries were categorized on the basis of the colonizers that colonized those countries. The orange at the bottom is part of Africa colonized by the United Kingdom. On the blue is part of Africa colonized by France. Green on the left and on the right of the continent are countries colonized by Portugal, etc. Figure 2 illustrates the current map of Africa, where there are entrenched boundaries with 54 countries. I then move to defining leadership. And this section deals with getting the archetypical mix right in identifying and understanding leadership effectiveness. There is no agreed upon definition of leadership in literature. In fact, there are as many definitions of leadership as the authors who define them, and these run into thousands. I have, in this lecture, a definition of leadership for collective wisdom. In fact, this theory, leadership for collective wisdom, is inspired by Ken Wilber's work on collective consciousness that was written in 2001. Further developed by Hamilton 2004, who wrote about the mystery of collective intelligence. In this lecture, I expand on this concept, tapping on insights from Katz de Vries 2010, whose views of leadership are recognizing that there must be a shift from the focus of a leader as an individual. And that shift must recognize leadership as being centered around shared, intricate, close-knit system of a team. This system of leadership possesses capabilities and experiences that enable the achievement of goals that benefit and transform society. Leadership performance is thus predicated on the ability of a leader to identify strengths and competences of each team member and match these competences to particular roles and challenges. This, as Katz de Vries 2010 points out, requires identification of certain recurring behavioral patterns that depict a complex confluence of the leader's inner theater, including significant life experiences. These patterns, as many writers have observed, emerge out of the inner theater of a leader as an archetype reflecting the role and behavior that impacts effectiveness or ineffectiveness of leaders within organizations. While it is beyond the scope of this lecture to delve deep into the history and theory of archetypes, it is important to touch on Carl Jung's 1875 to 1961 contributions to the field of archetypes. Jung is one of the first keynote scholars who studied the concept of archetypes. Jung believed that over thousands of years of human evolution, human beings share many common experiences of the physical and social world. The collective experience leaves an imprint in the collective unconscious of all human beings, and Jung called these imprints archetypes. As pointed out by Adamski 2011, Jung described the archetypes as universal inherited patterns and predispositions that help the human mind respond to, organize, interpret the world in a particular way. While much has been written about archetypes, the focus of this lecture is on the warrior archetype that defines the energy located in the psyche of the leaders that led battles in Africa from the 4th century right up to the 19th century. According to Tolman 2003, a leader holding the warrior energy is a model of courage, discipline, self-control, assertiveness, versatility, loyalty, and resilience. Warriors, as pointed out by Tolman, go to battles as a last resort, and they know when to back off and let others win. According to Bowman and Dill, the leadership traits that distinguish a warrior leader from every other leader or manager is creativity, the ability to see beyond the horizon, a steely temperament, and resilience when faced with crisis. Warriors are able to construct a power base through allies, networks, and coalitions. They welcome a challenge and are able to protect the environment when it is attacked. Gilbert 2018, on the other hand, views a warrior as someone who represents change and action. A warrior is not only decisive during his or her dance in the battlefield. The warrior is an embodiment of bravery with a strong presence and personal power. This resonates with how Rogers 2015 defined the warrior archetype. I quote, "To be a warrior means to live a life without pretense." Chogyam Trungpa, in his book titled Shambhala, The Sacred Path of the Warrior, echoes Rogers' definition of warriorship. He describes bravery as, I quote, being without deception. I now offer the conceptual bridge where leadership meets reflexivity. Conceptual bridges have been used by scholars as conceptual tools to unify concepts, variables, and methods from one discipline in new and powerful ways to find solutions to profound problems in a different discipline. In the field of mathematics, for example, we have seen how Mendel's genetic laws of inheritance are explained using linear algebra, which is a mathematical concept. Likewise, this lecture presents a theoretical bridge that links the warrior mystique archetypical traits and dispositions of leadership to reflexivity qualities. Let me hastily point out that as much as the warrior archetype is the focus of this lecture, singling this energy center should not be interpreted as meaning that a warrior in the battlefield only holds one center of power, and that of a warrior. A deeper gaze into the archetype literature reveals that leaders or warriors, literally and metaphorically, in the battlefield, are those holding several archetypical energies, reflecting the different roles and contexts in which their leadership dance is required. Caroline Myss in 2001, for example, posits that each person is endowed with 12 primary archetypes, and there are more than 12, which are part of their individual psyche. Other authors, for example, Tolman 2003, Bowman and Dill 2006, view the archetypical patterns as a hierarchical structure of dominant and not so dominant energy centers located in our psyches. Along the same line of thinking, Arian 1993 argues that there are 4 archetypical energies found in indigenous traditions. One is the warrior leader archetype. The second one is a healer or magician or wizard archetype. The third one is a teacher archetype, and the fourth one is a visionary archetype. I therefore agree with Stephen Jobs' expository of the role of a leader in an organization, in a modern organization, as that of a wizard that brings, and I quote Stephen Jobs, "A leader who's a wizard brings imagination, vision, intuition, creativity, magic, and substance to the work of leadership. They find new possibilities by seeking out and solving dilemmas before their competitors. They motivate and uplift followers with new and ingenious solutions to old problems. They push the creativity of others. They often perform managerial magic by accomplishing what most view as impossible, close quote. It is an established fact in literature that archetypes in our psyches are not always reflected positively because each archetype comes through in different shades of light, so to speak. Stein, 1998, puts across an evocative narrative about this subject. I quote, "The psyche consists of many parts and centers of consciousness. In this universe, there is not simple one planet, but an entire solar system and more." Caroline Myss goes on to describe so eloquently the shadow aspect of an archetype using the queen archetype as an example. I quote, "The queen archetype can help you assert your power, take charge of situations, delegate authority, and act with benevolence. But the shadow queen may run around barking out orders, making impossible demands, and cutting off heads." I close quote. Caroline Myss suggests that awareness of one's inner theater and archetypical energy at play allows one to harness the strengths and power of an archetype while mitigating the dark side of that particular archetype. In my own epistemic reflection as a critical realist, I take a stance that the warrior mystic archetypical energy of an effective leader is relative and is imprinted in a leader's inner theater within cultural contexts, facilitated by the metacognitive capabilities of that leader. I argue that the warrior mystic archetypical energy manifests itself through spoken and written speech acts, but in the co-creation of the warrior dance choreography with a team of dancers that co-create that social order. Paul Freire, an academic warrior himself, recommends a way of being to us as educators, working in metacognitive spaces of our students and our colleagues, as that of instilling the value of bravery and freedom that recognizes history, gender, race, class and power in ways that engender social transformation. I view this metacognitive space as an inner theater, a metaphorical womb where reflexivity cultivates the positive aspects of the warrior mystic energy. The following quotation from Paul Freire's groundbreaking work, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, gives us a glimpse of the inner theater of this academic warrior. I quote, "Leaders who do not act dialogically but insist on imposing their decisions do not organize the people. They manipulate them. They do not liberate, nor are they liberated themselves. They oppress." Close quote. I want now to explain reflexivity, to define reflexivity. Reflexivity is defined in literature as a metacognitive skill, a capability that manifests itself in coherent thinking, in coherent speech acts, and coherent behavior that transforms social actors in society into more evolved states of consciousness. Pitso, Matsipe, and Litseka's 2015 work defined reflexivity as an essential modality to adjust the actors to situations in ways that result in positive, transformative outcomes in society. There are 13 reflexivity definitions outlined in Table 1. There's one by Alexandra 2018, Alejandro 2018, Hopkins 1886, Finlay 2014, Miller 2018, May, and many other definitions. But for this inaugural lecture, I am focusing and adopting Babcock 1980's definition of reflexivity, which goes as follows. Reflexivity enables individuals to understand and adjust to the social process, modify future behavior, and then transform the social process itself. The development of the mind is predicated on reflexivity. Without reflexivity and dialogue between the personal I and the social me, there will be nothing novel in experience. Reflexivity is a source of novelty and freedom. The second definition is by Nobe Gelani, 2018. They provide a simple definition of reflexivity, and they call this, it goes as follows. Reflexivity is a practice that integrates the wholeness of intellectual, spiritual, emotive, and bodily knowing. I then want to just touch on the approach of this inaugural lecture, the science behind it and the methodology behind the framework that I'm introducing. Historiometry is a research approach that dates back to 1909, when the concept was first introduced by Woods. Woods describes this method of research as a process in which, I quote, facts of history are subjected to statistical treatment according to some method of measurement. Simpson, who's worked extensively in the space of historiometry, defines historiometry as a method used to test nomothetic hypotheses about personal thought, emotion, and behavior by applying quantitative and qualitative methods to data concerning historical individuals. In Figure 3, I illustrate a seven-stage process of designing a historiometric study. You will notice on the left-hand side that the very first step in designing a historiometric study is to frame research questions. The second step is to test the hypothesis. And I want to hastily say that testing of two hypotheses as presented in that is an avenue for further research emanating from this inaugural lecture. The third step in designing a historiometric study is to specify the theoretical model. This is then followed by the selection of the measurement methods, the sampling plan, and lastly, the data sources. These data sources are historic data of leaders that have served in a particular context and for the purpose of this lecture in extreme contexts. And lastly, data analysis. I then move to Table 2, just to share best practices in ensuring reliability and validity of a historiometric research methodology. In framing hypothesis, the validity issue that must be addressed is internal validity, and I present the best practice in testing and ensuring internal validity. The second stage, which is hypothesis testing, is also requires validity issues to be addressed. The third phase requires internal validity to be addressed. The fourth phase requires reliability, because here we are selecting the measurement method. Number 5, we are looking at external validity, and in collecting data sources, we are focusing our attention on content validity and external validity. And of course, when we are analyzing historiometric data, our focus of attention in terms of best practices must be external validity. I then now present the data, the historiometric data, which is snippets of historical cases to validate the frame that I'm presenting as part of the conclusion. But I want to first start by presenting a control case, a case before the 15th century. The Queen Amani Rena, ruled before Common Era, BCE. The question is, what is it about this queen that sets her apart when she led under extreme context before Common Era? If you remember your history, you'll remember that when Egypt under Cleopatra's rule had fallen to the Roman Empire, the kingdom of Kush was unwavering, standing up against the declaration of Kush and the enslavement of the Kushite people. A 5-year war erupted between the Kushites and the Romans in 27 BC to 22 BC. During the war, shortly after the death of her husband, the queen, the matriarch, Amanirenas, and her eldest son mobilized an army of 20,000 soldiers that drove the Romans out of Kushite territory. This is a strong indication of her ability to rise above emotions. This is a selfless leader, one who will put her people before herself. In response, the Roman governor of Egypt built an even stronger army and came back with full force. This did not stop the Nubian queen. Despite the many losses of soldiers, Queen Amanirenas could regroup her soldiers and fight until the governor of Egypt decided to step back. This not only indicates her drive and determination, but the power she must have had to convince a probably disheartened army of soldiers. We see here qualities of confidence, military intelligence, and oratory or influential language that placed the queen in a position to defeat the Roman force. Amarinas was remarkable for her swift decision-making in extreme context. She was not swayed by the bodies sprawled about her, including her family members, nor the possibility of death on her own part. To her, it was death or captivity. Although the figure of Queen Amanirenas is overlooked and not given the same spotlight as Cleopatra, it is important to understand that a time existed when thriving sub-Saharan empires were empires led by patriarchs and matriarchs who fought in wars and conflicts using diplomatic sensibilities, trickery, trade justifications, innovation in what was considered once upon a time a dark continent. I then move to another matriarch, Queen Zinga, 1583 to 1663. Queen Zinga was a warrior of note who led several battles to victory. Descending from a genealogy traced to a line of kings, Queen Zinga earned her title of a warrior queen when she personally led troops into battle and evaded every attempt to capture or kill her. The warrior queen fought against the Portuguese and their expanding slave trade in the 17th century. Queen Zinga's successful reign was largely attributed to a skillful manipulation of diplomatic relationships with her allies. For instance, history has it that Portugal had broken its side of the deal and Zinga would not give in to the Portuguese without a fight. As such, she formed a temporal alliance with the Dutch, an enemy of the Portuguese, and led an army against them. Zinga's virtuosity on the battlefield suggests a special kind of training and exposure to military tactics and strategy. In her book that portrays the sagacity, bravery, and fluid intelligence of the warrior queen, Henwood 2017 confirms that Nzinga's father structured a special training for the future monarch and exposed her to the battlefield at a young age. Henwood describes Nzinga as a ferocious military leader, waging wars against the Portuguese colonizers and their African allies, surviving multiple attempts to kill her. We then move to Shaka. And here it's just a question of pointing out how the socialization of a leader can manifest the dark and the lighter sides of a leader. Shaka had a very difficult childhood, which reflects in his personality. His personal characteristics are likely to have been shaped by the fact that he was shunned, tormented, and neglected by her mother's village for having a mother who bore a child with a rival clan, as described in Tesfu 2008. Shaka's childhood circumstances are bound to leave an emotional or psychological footprint in his inner theater. One could say this footprint had formed an emotional leader. He acted many moments out of anger or revenge, revealing more the shadow side of a warrior rather than the mystique, the magic, and the healing side of a warrior. For example, his most merciless time was at the death of his mother, where he assassinated hundreds of Zulu people and ordered crops not to be planted and milk not to be drunk for a year. And I want now to turn our gaze to Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, here we have a region that has given pride in the heart of many Africans, the only state that never fell under colonial rule. And here, what I want to point out is the characteristics of this particular leader. He had a highly developed sense of realities of power. He understood personal power. He understood how to use that power as an open-minded innovator. He set the values which Haile Selassie adopted as his own to bring Ethiopia into international community. Marcus, in his work of 1975, traces Menelik, who reigned throughout 1844 to 1938. He traces Menelik's training as a strategist, problem solver, and his strength with his expertise in conflict resolution. And these are additional attributes of effective leadership. Let's go to Kwame Nkrumah, 1909 to 1972. Here, we have a leader whose Afrocentric views were unmissable. Kwame Nkrumah was the first prime minister of Ghana, as we know. He was a leader who saw capitalism as the enemy to African prosperity. In his leadership, we saw the importance of sharpening one's intellect, dedicating time to understanding different ideologies and critical theories, and establishing where one finds themselves in these different ideologies. He made it clear and obvious that one cannot lead without an ideology, because that ideology shapes the direction of a leader. After 15 years of dedicated study in England and the United States, Kwame Nkrumah classified himself as a Marxist socialist. He had a set ideology, and his focus on mobilizing the ordinary people and recognizing their aims and views on political change was his forte. In summarizing the different attributes of leadership effectiveness, I then present figure 4, which is a warrior mystique leadership dance framework. And this is based on the personal traits and the behavioral traits traced from the presentation thus far of the warriors, the matriarchs and the patriarchs of the 15th century, drawing on the strengths that they based their successes on. I present a warrior mystique leadership dance framework, which is made up of the attributes, personal attributes, and behavioral characteristics. You will see in figure 4 that the personal characteristics include resilience, visual intelligence, vitality, selflessness, drive, versatility, integrity, openness to other views, agility, kinesthetic intelligence, assertiveness, perseverance, determination, fluid intelligence, innovativeness, steely temperament, fearlessness, intuitive intelligence, being without deception, self-assuredness. And the behavioral characteristics, drawing again from the snippets of history of leaders who led in extreme contexts in the 15th to the 19th century, you see the following behavioral characteristics: courageousness, disciplined leaders, self-controlled leaders, decisive leaders, loyal leaders, committed, ability to tap into the collective wisdom, transformative leaders, trustworthy leaders, reliable leaders, ethical leaders, ability to network, ability to liberate others, ability to influence others. This is the framework that is based on the historiometric data I presented earlier. In conclusion, we see that the snippets of African warriors who led during the transatlantic slave trades are leaders that were largely forced to lead battles and wars to protect their wealth, their land, and their communities from slave trade and from the Berlin Conference impositions that legitimized colonization. The curious thing about Africa, though, is that the lines between its strengths and weaknesses are often blurry. Its wealth in minerals exceed all other continents, yet it remains powerless in managing, controlling, and leading its economic and social affairs. The brave men and women warriors of the 15th century demonstrated unparalleled bravery, advanced warfare skills, military intelligence, confidence, endurance, resilience, drive, determination, problem-solving skills, organizing skills, oratory, and influential speech acts. They possessed the mystique, the warrior and wizard mystique in their psyche to influence thousands of men and women to sign their death certificates and join the war to protect their territories. The era of dehumanizing turf wars and slavery gave rise to relentless warriors for independence and liberation. The African warriors' passionate dream has been to rule their own territories, and that dream has been achieved. Africa in its entirety has gained independence. However, here is a paradox. The guns in Africa have not yet been silenced after more than 400 years of transatlantic trade, slave trade. Could it be that the imaginary boundaries set out at the Berlin Conference have so bewitched us here in Africa to a point where we have forgotten our connectedness? If not, if we have not forgotten our connectedness, why is it that civil wars, battles, and conflicts are still raging in Africa long after the transatlantic slave trade? Or is it possible that the seeds of slavery sown by our own dark and collective inner theaters are so potent that their effect cannot be shaken out of our consciousness? Or could it be possible that the scramble for Africa added to the existing kind of spell or muti that would keep African societies frozen in a conflictive theater where the boundary lines that have never existed have become solid and real, and where the shadow energy of our collective consciousness keeps the slaves in our psyche concealed? When Bob Marley, not so long ago, invited us to free ourselves from mental slavery, and when Steve Biko advocated for freedom from mental slavery, we were provided with evidence that slavery still exists. It has taken a different form, though, the one that is intangible and yet real. What will it take for the contemporary leaders of our institutions and our communities to free the imaginary slaves now located inside of us? Prof. Paulo Freire, in his well-acclaimed piece, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, put it eloquently when he argued that the greatest humanistic and historical task of the oppressed is to liberate themselves. This leads to a view that I would like to end this lecture with, that leadership, like the sun rolling in the sky, is oblivious of your title and your position. Just like the planetary system, the sun just does its thing, to shine blazingly with all its force and energy. Just like the sunrise, the radiant mystic power of leadership needs to be freed from the inner theaters to perform the leadership dance that transforms our society. I conclude my own dance, dancing with you, my dear audience, in this inaugural lecture by putting forward a contention that leadership performance is demonstrable as a meta skill, a meta competence, a capability, a sensibility, a way of being that does not have deception, a universe of intangibles that, when harnessed and unlocked through team spirit, society and communities can be transformed to evolved state of consciousness. I thank you.
Professor S.K. Ndlovu, Vice Principal, Strategy, Risk and Advisory Service, members of management, extended management, the community of the School of Business Leadership, of which Professor Msweli is the CEO and Executive Dean. I'd like to also thank members of the university community and members of business here present, the family of Professor Msweli, friends, students, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It gives me a great pleasure to reflect on the ruminations of Professor Msweli on the topic that is chosen as a reflexivity dance of warriors towards a historiometric model of leadership performance in extreme contexts in Africa. Having listened to Professor Msweli professing this new innovative concept of a stereometric model, certain things stand out and they all point to innovation in our times. She has taken us through the paces, talking about leadership effectiveness and doting, in a sense, on the idea which was prompted by Carl Gustav Jung of the archetype. But she lends a new twist to it by adapting it to a context and insisting that we must get the archetypal mix right. But further than that, the performance of leadership is clothed in the robes of a warrior, and thus the emergence of an idea of a warrior mystique and leadership reflexivity. Because in leadership, one requires a nimbleness and nimbleness of foot. One requires innovation and agility, new concepts that are hitherto unknown. And I'm very proud to say that the infusion of a histometric approach is quite rare in our times. And there must be a reason as to why this new innovative concept of a warrior-mystic leadership dance framework bears reference and has relevance for these, our troubled times. And I mean troubled times with respect to not just COVID, but also the background of industrial action that has been a Damoclean sword hanging over our heads. There must be a solution, and quite clearly, the signposts have been delivered by Professor Msweli in her lecture. It is quite new and relevant that today we have to move from a conceptual integration of critical reflexivity and leadership archetype theory, as I pointed out, because leaders are now leading in what she has termed extreme context. That means that at this point in time, to redeem the weight, lighten the tedium of the extremeness of the situation, there must be something for levitating in thought, in cognition, and in performance of leadership, a particular kind of cognitive move. But it is, according to existential demands, based on dance. And dance, for her and for us, is an operative metaphor because of its virtuosity, the demands of eloquence and elegance and agility that's adaptable to leadership. That is very key for our times. I want to thank Professor Msweli for pointing out, in a way that is exemplary of great, innovative, scholarly thinking, the example of the process of leadership theory development, and also testing this theory by using a histometric approach. And the pinnacle of it allows us to have a sense of continuum of history from slavery to present day. For those who might have missed the point, throughout the years since the beginning of transatlantic slavery to today, under the burden of the vaccine regimes that are imposed on us, the WTO agreements and tariff protocols that have been set upon us, there is an inbuilt code of slavery. And then she does not only disavow it, but provides an alternative to that as she goes out to show that today as a leader, you do not need a myopic leadership approach. You need to draw lessons from failures and successes of leadership from different historical contexts. One looks back at Helena of Troy, one looks back at Mkabayi, if you will, locally, but still the lessons have to be drawn so that you can have a warrior archetypal multi-metaphor that adequately meets reflexivity. I know that Professor Msweli has made a very bold statement about slavery and how best to defy its logic in our times. The times that she has described is extreme context. Extreme not only because of the economic malaise in which you are descending, extreme also because of the constraints that are imposed by global economies, the war that's taking place in Russia and its neighbors. So we want right now to contain the extreme context to our local situation, and she has done well to define and narrow it down to our context. Of course, her scholarship in defining extreme context is influenced by scholars such as Hannah, who have defined the extreme context in an extreme event or occurrence that may result in extensive and unbearable magnitude of physical, psychological, or material consequences to society and its institutions. Here I want to say further to that indeed there is much that has gone amiss. It's a winter of discontent and, to borrow from Victorian scholars, a winter of despair. So when one looks at the model that is being proffered by Professor Msweli, there is little doubt that virtuosity is required. And he has taken stock of the key events that have contributed to the development arrested in Africa, violently so throughout the years. And he has referenced Dassar, for example, who has shown complicity of our African leaders in the persistent fragility of post-colonial sub-Saharan Africa. And scholars such as Zenwa and Udensi, who also point out that slavery was enabled often by a complicitous relationship between African leaders, our very own, and the slave traders. So how do we now get ourselves free from the shackles of such complicity? Professor Msweli has made bold to reference the scholarship, of course, of Zenwa and Udensi, to point out that it's not only these leaders, but they are white predators and corrupt native allies that have contributed to the plague of slavery that have caught Africans unawares. But in this extreme context, as she calls it, of the transatlantic age, one also thinks of the brain drain that has taken place, and is no longer physical, but the collaborations that we're having with northern institutions under the hallmark of internationalization have contributed in many a way to the inferiorization of our mental contributions, our intellectual capital that was actually a trend that was born since the Berlin Conference of 1885. Uninformed Africans fell victim to this glorification of the North, and often it is violent, but now it is voluntary. I was caught by the remark that came, and I must say it is not with nostalgia, from Lord Salisbury, when he remarked that when I left the Foreign Office in 1880, nobody thought about Africa. When I returned to it in 1885, nations were almost quarreling with each other, meaning that there was now a scramble for Africa. And to this day, the bauxite, the platinum, the gold, the diamonds, and so on, are now moving in the direction of the illicit flows that accompany them. But we have now learned, courtesy of Professor Msweli, that these can be averted. These illicit flows can be undermined with the right leadership strategy. Of course, at the outset, I had made bold to state that it is important to get the right archetypal mix. And I think that what Professor Msweli was doing here was also delve into collective wisdom theory, which was inspired by Wilber's work on collective consciousness, and developed further by Hamilton, who wrote about the mystery of collective intelligence. And this has been duly expanded to make a seminal point about leadership and what needs to be done, the innovation, the moves that are agile, that are required so that when one actually understands the dance and gets into the rhythm of leadership, they have specific historical markers against which they are arranging the actions. So beyond the history and theory of archetypes, in this lecture that we have had, we also draw on energies that are based on the warrior archetype, and yet at the same time they hold very practical value to our lives. We have had occasion to encounter scholarship that defines the warrior archetype as an embodiment of bravery. To be a warrior means to live a life without pretense. Chogyam Trungpa, in his book titled Shambhala, The Sacred Path of the Warrior, echoes, and it's a religious definition of warriorship, when he described bravery as being without deception. What this means that when you're a leader, you cannot deceive others, you cannot deceive yourself, for time, place, circumstance will not entertain it for a little while longer, because circumstances in which you operate are way too complicated and at the same time simple enough to reveal on whose side you stand. Notably and unexpectedly, Professor Msweli takes stock of Stephen Jobs' expository of the role of a leader in an organization as a wizard that brings imagination, vision, intuition, creativity, magic, and substance to the work of leadership. A wizard, I emphasize. They find new possibilities of seeking out and solving dilemmas before their competitors. They motivate and uplift followers with new and ingenious solutions to old problems. This is about really innovation. So over and above the contribution of new concepts that Professor Msweli has given us, the important thing is the ability to choreograph one way throughout the dark forest in order to come up with new solutions that are honest, that are also agile, but above all, resonate with the psyche of solution finding. In the end, we get an understanding that an effective leader becomes one who holds the warrior mystic archetypal energy and draws from critical pedagogical stance. But it is true that it is not altogether new that in his work, Paulo Freire, indeed, the pedagogy of the oppressed, had already laid the brickwork for the building of this masterpiece that has been given by Professor Msweli today. We have heard that leaders do not act dialogically but insist on imposing their decisions, do not organize the people. They manipulate them, they not liberate, nor they liberate the oppressed, which is quite a frightening prospect for our times. I am a scholar of Michel Foucault and Gaston Bachelard, Gilles Deleuze. You understand the complex relationship between sovereign power and the subject. Also understand the biopolitics and governmentality of it. And I see that it is possible at this time that we need to revisit the very matrices of power and imposing upon the subject certain decisions that are unpalatable and yet necessary for our own release from the slavery that we have experienced. I was vastly impressed that Professor Msweli managed, therefore, to reference Peter's work, who says it's important for the heart and to connect with the body to its inner laboratory. That is quite significant in my thinking, and I'd like to think that this vast conglomeration of concepts that have been brought together will eventually make sense beyond this lecture, and the reflexivity indicators that had been outlined will vary from situation to situation. But as I pointed out at the very outset, a stoichiometrical analysis has become important as a method to test nomothetic hypothesis about personal thought, emotion, and behavior, where there is an application of quantitative and objective techniques to data concerning historical individuals. And I'm now, again, not returning to Mkabayi or to Helena of Troy. In this instance, I can easily refer to Chairman Mao Zedong. But I'm also glad that all of this points to a very heuristic trial and error approach, which is based on the 7-stage process of designing a stoichiometric model that has been given by Professor Msweli, who stands her theory, tests the theories on real characters in history that inform the rhythm of a dance. And there's the case of Queen Amanerinas, who reigned up to 10 BCE during the fall of the Roman Empire in Sudan, and Queen Zinga as well, a descendant of genealogy traced to that of queens in what today would be Angola. And of course, King Shaka Zulu, the great king who was very strategic and renowned for revolutionizing Zulu warfare, though he was touted and in history given as brutal and the killer of anyone who disagreed with him, there were many other pertinent strengths that were drawn for devising the unitary power of forward thinking. Ukusina, amabuto, ihlala, bubezi, ways. The rhythm of that dance of the warrior chant was connected to a particular kind of thinking. I'm grateful that Professor Msweli looked beyond mere regionalism, and looked to the exemplary case of Kwame Nkrumah, the father of Pan-Africanism, in order to show the kind of historical demands that today, in a geopolitical push to reclaim Africa, that there is a need for unity on a scale that is continental. These are therefore the very primers upon which Professor Msweli defines the personal characteristics of warriors that lead in extreme contexts. On this note, I'd like to thank you for allowing me to be part of the inner theaters, as it were, that were outlined by Paulo Freire and found their way back through the inaugural lecture of Professor Msweli, which has taken score of all the mishaps that have led us to slavery. And accordingly, we went to Paulo Freire and Steve Biko, who also wanted to move away from the glamour and illusion that we have provided every day through consumerism. And we are therefore encouraged that there is a reference, a recuperation to the king Ushaka Zulu, who now requires arts, place a very historical demand on us to create a new rhythm, a new song for our times, so that when there is peacetime and there is war, we must know what kind of warrior dance is required to save us as a nation, say university in this case. And indeed, I want to say that without waxing lyrical about what Prof. Msweli has outlined this evening, the one thing stands out, that leadership is like the sun rolling in the sky, oblivious of position, as it is in the planetary system. So there must be a connectedness to the universe. And with that in mind, indeed, decisions of leaders must resonate with one and all, the living and the dead, the earth and the skies. And we know that Professor Msweli is that kind of leader that we always wanted to have, because it is not just about theory and intellectual ruminations, but putting that into practice and allowing us to prosper in a way that is mentally liberated. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Vice Chancellor. Thank you, Professor Ndlovu, for allowing me the rare privilege to engage with what Professor Msweli so brilliantly has put to us by way of professing her own new methodologies that are hitherto unknown. And I'm very glad to be part of this project. It is a rare privilege, and I'd like to thank you one and all for lending me the opportunity to be part of the process of this kind of mental liberation and exposure to new concepts that are quite liberatory in content. Thank you very much, and good evening.
Members of Council, members of Senate, Madam Principal and Vice Chancellor, members of the academic community, students, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of our University Council and Senate and the leadership of the university, please join me in officially welcoming Professor Msweli to the ranks of full professors at the University of South Africa. Professor Msweli, thank you very much for your complex, instructive, and provocative lecture. It comes at an opportune time as we are engaged in curricular deliberations and transformation. We as UNISA pride ourselves as the African university shaping futures in the service of humanity. We are pleased to have you amongst UNISA's professors. As a university, we have now embarked on a process and deliberate efforts to focus on 10 niche areas, and these are research, sustainability and energy research, marine and water resource management, natural sciences focusing on biotechnological studies, governance, management interfaces and reporting systems, automotive, energy, fourth industrial revolution and digitization, health studies and medicine, feminist, womanist, modernization, and lastly, student support and co-curricular activities. As a professor, joining the ranks of professors at UNISA, we are relying on you and your team to ensure that we take these niche areas to new heights. On behalf of the Council, Senate, and University Management, I congratulate you on having achieved this academic milestone. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this afternoon's proceedings. Considering that we are doing this lecture online, I am sure you have planned for the celebrations of this day wherever you are. Be safe, and thank you very much.